everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My guest today is Richard Higgs, whose book is Bringing in the Sheaves. Welcome, Richard.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming. We've all heard stories about people who strike out to join the Foreign Legion and people who strike out to climb Mount Everest because it's there. You were working at the diner, also doing your photography work, when you acknowledged the call of the harvest. Tell us what that was like and what you did about it.
Well, it's back in the winter of 1991, and I was working as a fry cook in a little diner here in Tulsa, and I just found it a very constricting kind of existence, as you might imagine. It was crowded. It was winter. It was steamy in there, and I began having these daydreams about the plains. You know, the wide open spaces out there, those distant horizons, and just that clarity and simplicity that's out there. And for some reason, I just became obsessed with the idea of getting out there. And it occurred to me one day that I knew, and it seemed like I had always known, that there are people who work the harvest out there. You know, who travel every season from Texas up into Canada and cut wheat. And one of the things we did at the diner was we baked our own bread every day. And for some reason, I just got this vision of wheat, and I wanted to get out there and help with the harvest. It was an escape for me, I guess you could say.
How did your family respond to that when you told them that you wanted to go out and harvest and glean and reap?
Well, I guess my cooking had begun to suffer quite a bit at the diner, so I didn't run into a whole lot of I'm blanking out here. What's the word?
Resistance?
Resistance, yeah. I didn't meet a lot of resistance because, you know, I mentioned it to my wife, and we talked about it over a several-day period, and she was all in favor of it. You know, she was very supportive from the beginning of the idea. So when harvest time came, there I went.
Did you know when you started this journey, Richard, and we call it a journey, it's not only a literal journey but a spiritual journey, that you were going to write a book? Yeah,
I did. I had always wanted to write. Ever since before I was even willing to read, you might say. I mean, I had always wanted to write, and I think in most of my adult life I'd really had been waiting for that idea, and I knew right away that this was it. This was the idea I'd been waiting for. So the idea of escape, I guess you could say, from a gritty city winter and writing a book sort of dovetailed together real nicely in this project. So I went out with the idea from the start of writing about it.
It's a beautiful book, and I think your writing style is very unique and lovely. And I would like you, if you don't mind, to read a little bit of the prologue to this book, or the preface, because I think it says so much about how you feel about the harvest and the plains.
Okay. I didn't bring my reading glasses, but I think my arms are probably long enough.
Look like it to me.
Okay, this is from the preface. Every year on the Great Plains of North America, an undertaking of epic proportions takes place. By epic proportions, I mean thousands of people traveling a vast distance together over an extended period of time, participating in something of global economic, political, and social importance. That something is the harvesting of our wheat crop. Men and women have followed and worked the wheat harvest in an unbroken rhythm now for about 10,000 years. The sowing and reaping of that first wheat crop was a civilizing act, a turning point in the history of our species. And the idea of sowing and reaping wheat and all that has derived from that idea have made wheat a powerful symbol, a universal source for archetypal visions. And it was in pursuit of such a vision that I spent several months traveling the Great Plains, helping to bring in the sheaves.
As all that was going on, Richard, you were certainly busy when you were out helping to bring in the sheaves. How did you keep track of your ideas and what was going on? Did you keep a journal or outline or do anything like that to help you with the book later on, or did you write the book as you went?
I kept journal notes, you know, just some loose leaf notebooks, and as time allowed at the end of the day, you know, I would just jot down what happened that day and what thoughts had occurred to me that day. And sometimes 2 or 3 days would pass, you know, between journal entries, but that's basically how that worked. It was just dated journal entries, and I just collected those during the course of the harvest. and of course took photographs when I was able to get a grab shot now and then, you know. But my photography was always subject to the requirements of my job as a tractor driver, you know. But at the end of the harvest, when I got back to Tulsa, I took all those dated journal entries and just distilled them into a narrative, a story.
Did you go, Richard, with a completely open mind, or did you have certain preconceived notions about what this journey was going to be like for you?
Well, yes, I did have preconceived notions, and I think when you say the words wheat harvest, everybody gets these, as I say, archetypal visions, and my particular ones, I think, were kind of 19th century. You know, wheat harvest, and you just picture these brawny young men out there with, you know, with scythes, you know, cutting down the wheat, and maybe, I don't know, maybe women serving lemonade under shade trees. It was a romantic kind of vision, and it's really not like that at all when you get out there. The wheat harvest is the 20th century wheat harvest is a very mechanized thing, really. I mean, it's not even that physical. And also, there were a lot more details out there than I anticipated, which of course there always are.
Did having your camera with you and having to literally focus help you focus creatively as well in terms of the writing?
You mean, was the photography a factor in how the book was written? I don't think so, not really. No, they were really two separate components of the same pursuit, but I don't think creatively there was that much interplay between them, although I think they work well together in the finished product.
Oh, they do work beautifully, and if you'll loan me this book back, I want to look at some of these photographs because it's amazing to me how well they blend. And I wanted to look at one of your photographs here that I think is quite lovely. And the quote on this says, "I'd once stepped lightly along a particular cutting edge, and then misstepping, I became a falling man." What did you mean by becoming a falling man?
Well, prior to the working at the diner, I had a small business in Tulsa, and it was a creative business, and I worked with a lot of artists and photographers around Tulsa. And when that ended, I sort of was at loose ends for a while there, and I guess that's what I meant by a falling man.
Did going on this trip, this journey, this harvest help you recover yourself to a certain extent?
Well, yes, it did. By the time I got back, I guess you could say it was a circular journey. This journey ended where I began, and I was reconciled at the end. It did spiritually what I was after. Yeah, I got what I was after out there.
As a photographer, you made an interesting choice in your photographs, Richard, and you chose to do them in black and white rather than color. Tell us about that. What does that mean to a photographer, that kind of a selection, creative choice?
Well, for one thing, it was kind of a practical choice. I can print black and white. I can't print color. So that was one reason, you know, and if I can print my own photographs, of course, then I retain control over the quality of the print. And to any photographer, of course, that's very important. But another motive was that I was hoping for a kind of timelessness in the imagery that I personally have just never seen in a color photograph. I mean, I suppose it can be done, but I've just never seen it. You know, so that was really the reason for black and white.
Does a situation like you were involved in as a writer become pretty black and white to you as well? As you're writing the delineations?
I don't think so. I mean, that implies that things were simple, black and white. No, things were full of subtle tones out there. So in the writing, I hope to capture the subtlety of experience.
This has been described as a nature memoir, and a lot of us talk about writing our memoirs. What does it feel like to really do it?
Well, it felt really good. It was a creative experience, and I got to exercise the art of writing, and I got to tell a story that, as far as I can determine, has never really been told before. Because what these harvesters are doing out there is very important. And it's, I think, inherently literary too. And yet, the story hadn't been told, so I got to be the first one to tell it, and that felt really good.
Is it easier to know yourself when you remove yourself from the environment where you've been working and from the people you know and go out into a situation where you're untested?
Well, yeah, I mean, it does cause you to sort of examine yourself and see yourself out of context, and I think that's a healthy thing. You know, I think it's always a good idea to at least occasionally step aside from all the confusion of your life and step back and gain some perspective on it. And even today, I still do that quite often. I'm still drawn to the plains. You know, there's a clarity to the landscape out there and a simplicity to the horizon that is always very healing to me. There are places I still go frequently, you know, up in Osage County, up in the grasslands, for that very reason, to gain some quiet.
Did the people you were working with know you were writing a book?
Yeah, they did.
What was their reaction?
Well, you know, at first, of course, they were a little standoffish, as you naturally would be if, you know, someone's taking notes and taking photographs. But as we, you know, we literally live together as well as work together. When you're on the harvest, you do. So within a couple of weeks, it was just kind of invisible to them. It's something that people have to get comfortable with, and then once they do, they just completely ignored it. So the rest of the summer, everybody was perfectly natural, and I was just another one of the team there.
Well, there are certain things you couldn't include in this book because this is such a big experience, and I don't mean for reasons not of offending someone, but this was such a big experience. Did you feel frustrated by the limitations of the book that you couldn't include everything?
No, I wouldn't say I felt frustrated, but I did realize in the writing of this book, I realized something for the first time, that if you want to describe an experience, there are literally an infinite number of truths that you can tell about that experience. And there's also an infinite number of facts that you can use to support those truths. But so whether you realize it or not, you know, you're going to be telling a highly selective set of truths when you tell what happened. And that's what happened to me. I had to select the truths I was going to tell. It wasn't frustrating, but it was interesting to realize that even in nonfiction, in a sense, it comes out fiction just by omission. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm saying that very clearly.
Yeah, no, I know, because you can't include everything, and
Right.
so it's not the total story, it's a part of the story, a part of a greater story.
Exactly. And rather than frustrating, I found that useful because I got to select the facts that were useful to the story I wanted to tell. So it worked out fine.
Did distance help you do that? When you got back home to Tulsa and you were writing on this book and looking back over the notes, did that give you a new perspective or a fresher perspective on the experience?
Well, yeah, I think the passage of time is very important to that. You know, you may be, if you're keeping a journal, you know, you may think that particular journal entry that you're writing is brilliant and important.
I have a lot of times like that, yes.
But if 6 months passes and you look at it, you see it clearly, you know. And so, yeah, that was very helpful to let some time pass. In fact, when I got back from the harvest, I purposely didn't look at it for 6 months. I just put it aside and got on with my life and didn't even give it much thought. And then when I went back to look at it, I could see it clearly and make my judgments more soundly.
Did your wife read it right away, the journals, and did you share with her early on?
No, not really. Once I got the manuscript in a finished condition, then she did. But, you know, while it was a work in progress, I really didn't want anyone peeking in there, you know, not even her.
When she did read it for the first time, and I'm sure you were anxious for her response, was she surprised by anything she discovered?
She was inscrutable.
Well, we're going to talk some more, Richard. We want to come back and talk a little bit more about what you harvested on this trip. We'll take a brief break and be back with more from Richard Higgs and Bringing in the Sheaves.
This is an RSU-TV encore presentation of Writing Out Loud.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome back to Writing Out Loud. We're visiting with Richard Higgs, who's written Bringing in the Sheaves, about his involvement with the wheat harvest and about this adventure he took in his life. We were commenting earlier on the first segment, Richard, about these wonderful photographs you took in black and white, and we're trying to pick them up as best on camera as we can, but these wonderful phrases that you have that go with the photographs and the way that the narrative blends with the photography. And I love this line, the plains must be their own metaphor. Did that insight come easily to you?
That insight came to me when I was standing on a hill in the sand hills of Nebraska, and I was grasping for a way to describe what I was surrounded by out there. These beautiful rolling grass-covered dunes, and it occurred to me that whenever we try to describe the plains, we always refer to a sea of wheat or a sea of grass. We always describe the plains in terms of the sea, and it occurred to me that that's really inadequate. Because what you sense when you're standing out there on a promontory out on the plains with that distant horizon around you in every direction is not the restless churning of waves, but utter stillness. I mean, the land is just utterly still out there, and that's the appeal of it to me, the stillness. And so, describing it in terms of the sea has become such an automatic response when people try to describe the plains that seems to be the only way we can describe it. But really, I find it inadequate. But on the other hand, I can't think of any other way to describe what you see out there. So I don't know if there is another metaphor. The plains, in the end, are their own metaphor.
Did the idea come to you first, or did the photograph in that particular instance? Or did it just coincide?
Well, that insight came to me while I was writing, not taking photographs so much, while I was trying to describe it with words. I mean, I can photograph the plains, and then that issue of what metaphor you use to describe it is not really an issue.
Let's talk a little bit about this journey and this adventure on a metaphoric level. What did you harvest on this trip besides, your personal insights? What about the people you met? Did you harvest a lot from them?
Well, I got a lot of stories out there. I found, one thing I wanted to do was wherever we were, I wanted to find out about that place, from Holiday, Texas to Gettysburg, South Dakota. And I found that it was really easy to gather stories. People want to tell you their stories if you just ask. And so wherever our harvest caravan stopped for a week or so to harvest wheat, I was able to find out a little bit about that town or that rural area, some of its history and some of the stories that make up its history.
Can you think of someone who stands out as one of the stars of this harvest adventure?
Well, let's see. I guess the first one that comes to mind is I heard the story in Gettysburg, South Dakota, of Mary O'Brien, who, and this was told to me by a really, really old librarian in the town library at Gettysburg. And I won't recount the whole story here, but she was the first woman settler of Gettysburg, South Dakota. And she was quite a woman, and her story was to me quite an inspiring story. So I included it in the book.
As well as many others. And
right.
You also mentioned in this book, and I thought this was an interesting statement, that the boundaries cease to exist, boundaries between states, and I assume boundaries between people, as you get more involved with the harvest. How does that come about? Why does that come about?
Well, the wheat country, well, first of all, the reason I wanted to tell it in those terms was because I had read numerous journals of 17th, 18th, and 19th century travelers in the area. And one thing I noticed is that political boundaries, when they even existed back then, were pretty much irrelevant to the writer's sense of where he was. What mattered was what was physically there, water holes, trails, towns, that sort of thing. What was physically there, not arbitrary dotted lines on a map. And that was something I noticed reading these journals of earlier travelers. And something else I noticed that corresponded with that was that the wheat country is not a political area, it's a physical region. And and political boundaries are equally irrelevant to people who harvest wheat. You're out there in the wheat country. And that's why the boundaries were irrelevant. And that's why I chose not to really mention, I'm in this state, now I'm in this state. It just seemed irrelevant. And I also wanted the reader to kind of see the area in a new light.
Have you carried that with you? Have boundaries become less important to you since you've been involved with this harvest?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the plains now as the plains, not the plains states.
It's nicely put. So far we've been talking about this on a metaphorical level. What was it like on a literal level? I mean, there's a lot of hard work out there. And what did you bring in besides the sheaves? Any sore muscles?
Well, that was one of the surprises for me out there. As I mentioned earlier, I envisioned it as being really rather physical. And that's just not the way it is. It's so mechanized now that it's really not very physical work, I must say. The hours are pretty long. But, you know, I was driving a tractor, and I had an air-conditioned cab. You know, it was pressure sealed to keep the dust out. I had a radio. You know, it wasn't that physical. We would get tired only from the long hours, because when you're in the real midst of the harvest, you want to catch as much wheat as you can every day. And so you start as soon as the moisture dries out of the fields in the morning, and you go until the moisture at night when the dew comes back. And so that can be for some pretty long days. But as far as physical labor, that only happened when something broke, you know, when something went wrong.
And I imagine that did happen from time to time.
It did, yeah.
And nature probably didn't always cooperate with you. Robert Frost said nature in the raw is seldom mild.
Boy, that's for sure. Because that summer was an El Nino summer. And so it was very, very stormy all up and down the plains. And we fought tractors swallowing mud everywhere we went. And that was one factor. But rather than making it more physically difficult, that tended to keep us pinned up in the bunkhouse longer watching PBS.
Richard, was it hard to leave the harvest behind? You speak about it with such affection, really, and very fondly. Was it hard to leave?
Not really. I can't say that it was. When I left, I had gained from it what I went to get. So it was okay. It was just it was over. The harvest was done, and it was time to go home.
So there's a sense of closure there.
Yes.
In your book, you have this wonderful epilogue I'd like you to read for us. And it says epilogue, but to me it seems like almost a new beginning for you.
Okay. Okay, this is after I got back off the harvest and was back in the diner. Soon it will be daylight. Through the diner's frosty windows, I see headlights sweep across a road sign out by the street. Route 66 shaking in the winter wind. My third cup of coffee sits tepid beside me on the counter. The room is filled with the aroma of bread ready to come out of the oven. I remember when I used to wonder if I had been saved or captured by this place. I never really answered that question. I just stopped asking it. Not long after I got home, I asked Mama to teach me how to bake bread. I met her at the diner at 4:30 every morning to help knead the dough, grease the pans, load the ovens, until she judged that I had become sensitive enough to the dough to be left alone with it. It's risen enough to put in the oven, she tells me, when it feels just like a woman's breast. I've been thinking about this place lately. I think that when the weather warms up, I'd like to give it a fresh coat of paint. Some nice, soft shade of yellow ochre about waist high, all the way around the building. And above that, cerulean blue all the way up to the eaves. And I think I'll trim the windows all in white. Debbie and the crew will be here in a few minutes to get the place ready to open for the day, stamping the cold from their feet and hanging up their coats. Women bearing vessels, stirring the first day's laughter up from a coffee cup. Someone will turn the signs around. And then the hungry crowd will come jingling through our door, smiling with anticipation, comforted by the pungent, earthy aroma. I will watch them raise my bread to their lips, lips pausing in conversations, conversations arising all around me, and I'll take my own comfort.
That passes the jealousy test. I wish I had written that. Where has this bread baking led you? What new adventures are in store? What other harvests are out there that you need to look into?
Oh,
become a part of?
I don't really know. Not long after all this ended, I ended up driving a truck over the road for a couple of years. And that was a journey in a much larger sense even than this. I mean, I was out there for 2 years living on the highways, and it was larger geographically too. I mean, coast to coast, big swaths of Canada. And what I'm working on now is trying to distill that adventure into a narrative as well.
Because this book was successful, do you feel pressure to get another book out fairly soon?
In a sense, yeah. But it's just a personal thing. I mean, I don't feel pressured because of the public or anything. I feel like I need to creatively push myself a little further on the next project. Yeah, but I don't think it's that pressure that, in a marketing sense, that sort of thing. Just in a creative sense.
Do you ever think you'll go into fiction at all?
Well, the book I'm working on now, based on my travels driving a truck, seems to be leading me into fiction. And I'm going to follow it wherever it takes me.
It's nicely said. Do you write poetry at all? Because you have a poetic quality to your writing.
Oh, once in a while I'll write down a little verse, but usually after I come across it a month later, I find it rather embarrassing and throw it away, you know, so not really, I guess is the answer.
As you enjoy the success of this book, has it brought you in touch with a lot of people who envy your time in the harvest?
Well, I suppose it's probably more accurate to say it's brought me in touch with a lot of people who've been touched by the harvest. I've really been surprised how many people have that I run into, and I mention this, who've either worked the harvest themselves or they have family members who have. Out here, it's really touched a lot of lives, and people are happy to have that story told, I think.
Well, Richard, congratulations on bringing in the sheaves. We'll look forward to your next book and to your photographs. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.